Hey guys, it's Celestia, and today we're gonna talk about Junji Ito. Every time I'm asked to name an artist that inspires me, he is always first on the list, and I know that's the case for a lot of artists out there. But it's not just artists that are obsessed with his work as of late, it's everyone. His popularity seems to know no bounds, attracting interest and acclaim even from those that wouldn't normally be interested in it at all. Despite his work being in manga form, liking manga isn't a prerequisite to enjoy it. A common sentiment you'll hear from many readers is, I don't normally like manga, but I love this. Even those who don't normally enjoy horror are known to express that Ito's art and stories pulled them in and got them interested anyway. There's something about the way he draws and writes that has the power to captivate readers and viewers of all kinds, and as a result, his popularity has skyrocketed, not just amongst manga fans or horror fans, but society as a whole. Junji Ito has become a household name that most of us have at least heard of, even if we hadn't read his work or seen his art, and I wanted to know why. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying he doesn't deserve that popularity. I would easily, without hesitation or shame, call myself one of his biggest fans, and I don't deny at all whatsoever that he's earned every ounce of praise that he's received. But as both an artist and a massive fan of his work, I found myself incredibly curious as to how he's managed to reach such astronomical levels of success and acclaim, even amongst audiences that might not normally be interested, because that's not an easy thing to do, even with beautiful art and compelling stories. What sets him apart from other horror mangaka? What is it about his work that's drawn millions in, skyrocketing his popularity and cementing him as the artist who revolutionized horror? To find out, I spent this entire month living and breathing Junji Ito. I read everything he's ever written, analyzed every piece in his art book, watched every episode of his anime adaptations, and accumulated over 20 pages of notes taken about all of it. And today, in what will likely be a pretty long video as a result, I'm gonna try to use those notes and results to break down exactly what it is about Junji Ito's art that has made him so incomparably popular. In the process of doing so, I'll also be going over why both of his anime adaptations completely failed, at least in terms of public opinion and general reception. But just to be abundantly clear, I have no intention of criticizing the anime for criticism's sake. I'm criticizing it for comparison's sake, because to thoroughly and entirely express what aspects of Ito's work are so unique and defining, I have to bring attention to how those aspects were almost altogether absent in the anime, resulting in fans being disappointed and generally less interested in it. I'm not jumping on the bandwagon of haha the anime sucked, because quite frankly I don't think it did, and I actually enjoyed it. I think it's the overwhelming popularity of Ito's work and the uniqueness of his style that led to very, very high expectations for that anime, and subsequently led to its poor reception when it failed to meet them. But I can't analyze his art without analyzing what the anime did wrong in reinterpreting it, so I will be covering that at the end. Another point I'd like to clarify before I get into this is that while I will be analyzing what makes Junji Ito's art stand out from other horror mangaka, artists, and creators, I will not be making direct comparisons between him and other individual artists. I personally feel like that's not only not the best way to most accurately analyze his work, but it would end up needlessly putting down the work of other artists, which I don't want to do. Instead, the comparisons made in this video will be between Ito's work and the horror genre as a whole, which, yes, includes the works of other artists, but will not involve name-dropping them or comparing them outright and directly. Finally, I want to issue the obligatory spoiler warning because I will be discussing some major plot points of his stories, so if you haven't read them or watched their anime-adapted counterparts, don't watch this if you don't want things spoiled for you. I won't be going into a lot of detail about any story in particular, although I do plan to make a video series analyzing each of his stories individually if that's something you guys would be interested in seeing. But I will absolutely reveal spoilers when it's pertinent to something I'm talking about, so you've been warned. It should also go without saying that in a video that will show Junji Ito's art, there will be some disturbing panels included if body horror is something that you find disturbing. And while I won't be showing anything that contains real gore or sensitive subject matter, do consider this to be your trigger warning for the fact that material from both his manga and anime works will be shown as reference throughout the duration of the video. Now, to properly illustrate what makes Ito's work so compelling, distinctive, unique, and popular, I can't just talk about the art itself. Yes, his art style is a huge part of the reason that he's become so world-renowned, but it's also his stories that are integral in making his work stand out from the rest. To best explain both, this video will be broken down into sections: the analysis of his art style, the analysis of his stories and narratives, the analysis of the anime, and then the final conclusions about how all of those things work together to make Ito's art the groundbreaking, incomparable horror experience that it is. It will also be chaptered based on those sections, so feel free to skip to those you're interested in. Although since each section will build upon the last, it's encouraged that you do watch in order to best understand the points introduced. First, as I said, is the art style. Ito's art style is often one of the first things to draw readers in, because there's something so haunting, striking, and unsettlingly beautiful about it. It's not just eye-catching, it keeps the eye, and forces the viewer to linger on the image, often wanting to look away due to the content it depicts, but being unable to because because of how expertly it's being depicted. So what is it about his art style that achieves this so consistently, time and time again? Well, in my opinion, it's a combination of three things: the way he draws characters in particular, the way he shades, and his strategic use of heavy detail. Let's start with the way he draws characters, because to me, it's a huge part of the reason his work isn't just beautiful, but also achieves the feeling of being inherently wrong or off in some way. Typically, Ito's characters are drawn very lifelessly. Their skin is pale and lifeless, defined completely by the natural white of the page without any blush to show emotion or humanity, or even much shading. It's not just the skin and features that are lifeless though, it's the expressions too. In neutral situations, Ito rarely draws his characters with prominent emotion shown on their faces. They're rarely smiling or frowning beyond a slight curve of the lips, with eyebrows rarely raised or lowered to reflect a feeling in everyday life. Emotion, for the most part, is something Ito only draws in extremes. He rarely draws a character slightly sad. He's much more inclined to draw them go from neutral and unfeeling to completely lost in despair. Rather than drawing a character somewhat happy or content, he'll draw them overcome by euphoria. Instead of drawing them a little anxious or uncomfortable, he'll draw them utterly horrified or disgusted. It's the initial lifelessness of their expressions that make these extreme, heavily emphasized and detailed expressions so much more powerful by contrast, and it even results in positive emotions looking disturbing and unsettling when a character feels them. This is emphasized further by the next prominent way Ito's style stands out from others in terms of character art specifically: the intentionally very heavy focus on eyes, both in style and composition. Eyes are often used compositionally to build suspense through creative and effective panel arrangement, and not only are eyes frequently the focal point of the panel, they're almost always the focal point of the face itself. And that is perhaps why Ito deliberately and pointedly bringing so much attention to them is so powerful, as it forces us to watch the souls of his characters become broken, corrupted, and disturbed. He does so by drawing eyes with much more detail than other features, with them being very realistic and complex, while the nose, eyebrows, and mouth are all rather simple, resulting in them standing out not only as the feature we should be most focused on, but also as somewhat unnatural and off-looking. Many have compared it to an Uncanny Valley-esque appearance, akin to looking at a cartoon character with hyper-realistic eyes. This hyper-detailing emphasizes lifelessness in neutral situations and the intensity of emotion in extreme situations, because a character's eyes going from detailed but empty to even more detailed and distorted in pure terror is compelling, to say the very least. The dramatic expressions Ito draws more and more as the horror of his stories unfolds are heavily reliant on this focus to communicate that feeling, and it's undoubtedly one of the aspects of his style that's most notoriously well-known and recognizable, not to mention effective. He also frequently uses them to show comparison between separate characters. If one character is more afraid than the other in the panel, for example, the character that's more afraid will have their eyes given much more detail, not only showing us the contrast between their emotional states clearly and simply, but also drawing more attention to the more emotional character. Eyes are even a narrative focus in many stories, presumably as a result of Ito's strength in drawing them so uniquely, like in A Father's Love, where blank, heavily lidded, and detailed eyes with bags are given to characters being possessed by the father, or in Unendurable Labyrinth, where eyes are heavily and constantly focused on because of the main character's overwhelming fear of being seen and scrutinized by the eyes of others. It's not just humans, though, that Ito succeeds so notably in depicting distinctly when it comes to how he draws his characters. Non-human characters, and the subhuman characters that humans become, aren't just drawn and designed to be disturbing. They're created and depicted to emphasize the horror of the story. The monsters aren't drawn to be just scary in any way. They're drawn based on the specific fear they're supposed to elicit. This sets them apart because they're much more personal, effective, and disturbing. Honored Ancestors' creature wouldn't have been nearly as disturbing if it had been created for shock value, with just the resemblance to a centipede and emphasis on body horror. It's also disturbing because it's drawn and designed to emphasize the plot, the family, and the obsession. When asked in an interview how he creates his monsters, Ito said, "You can't just draw a monster out of the blue. You have to have an idea and a story, and only then can you see what the monster looks like." So the reason his body horror art is so unique and compelling is because he doesn't write a story around using art and monsters for shock value, but rather expresses the story through the art in every way, including the creation of the monsters themselves. Ito's work is also often very anatomically accurate, at least within the confines of impossible body horror. He does his best to distort human bodies in an almost plausible way, like it could actually happen to a real person, to you even if it couldn't be survived like it frequently is in the stories. Detail and realism in his body horror is integral in making the reader feel as if it could happen to them, as if they could be in the main character's position. But now let's talk about where his style shines in terms of shading and heavy use of detail. Junji Ito almost never uses stock textures like halftone to shade his work, nor does he frequently even use gray to establish areas of shadow. Instead, Ito does most of his shading through intricate, hand-drawn lines, denoting areas of shadow with much more heavily repeated, layered lines. No matter what he's shading or how he's shading it, it's almost always done with nothing more than the use of these lines to varying degrees, which doesn't just yield a more unique, distinctive style, it also makes the things he's shading more unsettling. It gives his textures more power and impact than they would have had if simple grays or stock brushes were used, especially when he's depicting something truly horrifying and disgusting. The fact that the majority of his shading is, subsequently, almost completely limited to black and white rather than shades of gray also helps emphasize another of his stylistic strengths: contrast. Ito frequently uses dramatic, exaggerated contrast between black and white to draw the reader's attention to the panel's focus, something that is not only visually distinct and appealing, but also often creates a feeling of shock, isolation, fear, and even claustrophobia in the process. The fact that his shading maintains this heavy contrast means that this is empowered and emphasized in every way, yielding work that's much more hard-hitting than it would have been otherwise. His works with color are, as a result, generally less compelling, because the most interesting, appealing, and recognizable aspects of his style are the black and white contrast and the shading done with hand-drawn lines. Adding color reduces that contrast, and since the shading is done with color, there's no need for it to be shaded with lines. So most of the most important aspects of his work are reduced or eliminated. His works with color that still have lined shading and high contrast, however, are generally more impressive, or at least more recognizably his. I don't mean to say that his colored work is inferior by any means, as much of it is absolutely gorgeous and impossible not to appreciate. It's just not quite as disturbing or recognizably Ito. But it's not just how Ito shades that's so notable, it's also when he shades. For example, faces are shaded minimally before the horror begins, but increasingly dramatically as the plot progresses and they begin to experience more intense emotion. This is often a gradual process and subsequently a compelling visual reminder that the plot is becoming more harrowing, as seen with Shuichi's paranoia and dread in Uzumaki and Reishi's obsession and despair in Lovesickness. Characters distinctly go from being drawn with little to no shading on their faces to being drawn with intricate shading focused on eye bags, gaunt cheeks, and so on. Other characters, like the Hikizuri siblings or Soichi Tsuji, are given more detail in their facial shading from the get-go to emphasize that they're already disturbed or unsettling to some degree. This is one of the most effective examples of Ito limiting shading and detail in neutral situations and emphasizing it to an extreme degree in more intense situations, which shows how expertly he uses a stylistic choice in his art to give the narratives depicted more power and weight. And it's not just faces either. He uses hyper-detailing in his art to draw focus and attention to aspects that are supposed to be disturbing: eyes, mouths, skin, creatures, patterns, items, and so on. All of this, combined with his expert understanding of composition, results in an incredibly immersive reading experience, as his compositions also work exceptionally well to draw the reader's focus to certain aspects. Many panels are powerful specifically because of the build-up to them, often done using the aforementioned zoom-in on the character's shocked or horrified face before revealing what they're reacting to, forcing the viewer to stare at and focus on the horrifying aspects revealed for long periods of time just to take in all that detail. It's also often designed to have a big reveal on the other side of the page, so seeing the zoom in on the character's horrified expression only to know that whenever you turn that page, you're gonna see why they're reacting that way, creates a combined feeling of dread and anticipation all at once. But while all of that already sets Junji Ito's work apart on the basis of his art style alone, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Like I said at the beginning, we can't examine and determine why he's such a popular horror pioneer without talking about his stories themselves too. It's his art combined with his narratives that puts him in a league all of his own within horror. So now that we've talked about his art, let's talk about those stories too. Just like before, I've broken down what exactly makes Junji Ito's storytelling so popular and distinctive down to a few primary aspects, those being the way he writes characters, the focus on normalcy, his tendency to take the duality of obsession, love, and desire to the extremes of madness, his frequent narrative focus on humanity and its corruption, and the bizarre and otherworldly strangeness of his take on cosmic horror. To start, just like with his art style, let's talk about the way he writes characters, because the way he writes them has just as much of an impact as the way he draws them. One very notable example of this is that his characters are rarely particularly developed, with very little backstory, personality, or individuality, effectively serving as a blank slate in most cases. This allows the reader to project themselves onto those characters, and subsequently imagine themselves in the same scenarios the characters are subjected to. The less polarizing, defining characteristics a character has, the less chance there is of a reader not relating to them enough to create this immersion. Furthermore, the primary characters being generally unemotional and unaffected rather than lively, enthusiastic, irritable, or otherwise expressive creates even more significant contrast between them and characters who are not that way, which is usually significant to the plot, as well as their own future selves when they begin to experience much more extreme emotions later on. This also results in strange, odd, and even horrifying things being treated as if they're normal due to the character's lack of reaction to them, which is unsettling in and of itself. When the characters do have unique or defining traits, those traits are generally extreme phobias or obsessions, both of which are integral to and eventually eventually exacerbated by the plot. The character, in this case, is effectively only given this slight definition because they're a vehicle for the plot development. If a character is afraid of being seen, a plot that involves a lot of eyes staring at them is going to be more interesting. If a character is afraid of slugs, it's going to be way worse if her tongue suddenly turns into one, her body disintegrates, and her head, fully aware and conscious, is indefinitely forced to live on as the shell for that snail. If a character is phobic of spirals, it's going to be a lot more compelling to watch them be inescapably surrounded by them and forced to realize that there's one in their ear, the cochlea, that they can't get rid of without maiming themselves in the process. The more developed and prominent those phobias and obsessions are, the more powerful the plot becomes when it centers around the thing they're phobic of or obsessed with, especially when that's the only personality trait the character actually has. It's not just the characters themselves that are written so uniquely, though. It's also the roles that they play in their respective plots. There are no real antagonists or villains in Ito's stories, even when there are characters that are responsible for doing bad things and wronging others, because even then, the overarching evil or conflict is almost always an inexplicable but all-powerful force rather than the individual. The human aspect that makes a villain beatable and surmountable is completely eliminated by this, emphasizing the inescapability of the conflict. We can't understand why the thing is happening, and we cannot attribute it to a killable or avoidable figure, so it's much more threatening. A human or even a monster being responsible for causing the narrative's primary problem allows us to imagine an outcome where the problem is resolved. All that has to be done is get rid of that human or monster, which feels perfectly possible if they are just one person or creature. But a force that is impossibly powerful, undefined, and beyond any human comprehension, that's not something we can stop. How are we, as the reader, supposed to feel like the main character that we're supposed to relate to has any chance of defending themselves against and surviving something that we can't even understand? You can't play poker if you aren't holding any cards, as a famous X-Files quote goes. And in Ito's stories, we, as those who are forced to empathize with the main characters, are never holding any cards. Without a villain to beat, we're completely helpless to the horrors unfolding. And there's no real protagonist either. There are characters that the plot follows or is told in the perspective of, but they certainly aren't heroes working to achieve concrete, righteous, quote-unquote, good goals to advance the plot. They're just normal, everyday people subjected to completely abnormal and inescapable fates. Not because they're necessarily trying to fight against the evil of the story and suffering as a result, but simply because they're there, and that was enough. They did absolutely nothing in most cases to deserve it. It's just happening anyway. But moving past Ito's characterization in stories, let's talk about the focus of those stories on the mundane. Utter normalcy turned horrifying. His tendency to turn normal, everyday things and themes into horrifying things elicits a feeling that anything and everything has the potential to be dangerous. Records, hair, spirals, even chairs or apologies. They're things that most of us encounter regularly, so turning those mundane things that we have personal and regular experience with into threats is particularly effective and poignant. The way the relatable normalcy of the setting slowly deteriorates into inexplicable horror is much more compelling than jump scares or shock value, because rather than throwing us right into it, it lulls us into a false sense of comfort and then slowly takes that away. His characters treating abnormal things as normal, conversely, is equally disturbing. In A Town Without Streets, the reader is practically begging Saiko's family to acknowledge their increasingly strange behavior, and then begging her aunt to be reasonably alarmed by her hometown abolishing privacy altogether and allowing strangers to go wherever they want. It's them treating these things as if they're normal that's so unsettling and eventually even terrifying, because it makes the reader feel like they're going crazy as the only ones reacting normally. It's almost like you're being gaslit by the plot. The same can be seen in Toontown, where the entire town's population is totally fine with the fact that people turn into full-on tombstones wherever they die, leaving the entire town littered with hundreds upon hundreds of tombstones. And in Uzumaki, where both the reader and Shuichi himself are desperate for his father to see the abnormal, obsessive, extreme nature of his fixation with spirals. It's something that's present in a massive number of his stories, and it contributes to the Uncanny Valley-esque feeling that something is just slightly off or wrong with the characters and plots that we're reading, because they aren't responding to things how we know inherently they should be. And in terms of characters not responding to things naturally or rationally, let's move on to yet another prominent example of Ito's storytelling that's so distinctive, unique, and fascinating. Its focus on taking powerful emotions like obsession, love, guilt, and desire to the extremes of pure madness. These themes ultimately are so effectively scary because there's something particularly terrifying and inescapable about the concept of the villain being the character's own mind. There is nothing more truly inescapable than your own mind, and having it turn on you and deteriorate into pure madness and insanity is one of the most horrifying concepts there is. The characters in these cases are effectively responsible for their own fates, forced by their own minds to put themselves through the story's torments whether they want to or not. Uzumaki shows the duality of this perfectly, exemplifying both ends of the extreme. Shuichi's Shuichi's father's obsession with spirals turned to overwhelming love and subsequently madness, resulting in his demise at his own hand in an effort to turn into a spiral himself. His mother's obsession with spirals, on the other hand, turned into an overwhelming fear of them, a fear that would lead her to the same fate at her own hand by trying to remove every spiral from her body, including the cochlea in her ears. Seeing both extremes contrasted like that really emphasizes the feeling of powerlessness that it elicits, because no matter how you react to the threat, in this case spirals, you're doomed, and you're doomed to your own mind. Many other stories focus on obsession in similar ways. Love Sickness's Reishi's love for Yusuke becomes so extreme and obsessive that her physical health begins to drastically deteriorate. Every male character's obsessive love of Tomie either leads to their death or hers out of inexplicable, uncontrollable compulsion alone. All of the major characters in splatter film, or Smashed, become so obsessed with the nectar that despite knowing eating it will kill them, they all still do. The Enigma of Amigata Fault shows hundreds and hundreds of people becoming terrified of the human-shaped holes that appear, and knowing that entering them probably means death or suffering. But all of them are eventually forced by their own obsessive compulsions to enter them anyway. There are also a multitude of stories that focus on artists' obsessions with creating perfect work, which is kind of interesting given that it's being written by an artist. Regardless, even the purest of motivations are corrupted and taken to extremes, and the characters subjected to this madness inevitably either choose their own tragic fates or are simply unable to stop doing the thing that will seal them, showing how utterly powerless they are, not only to the forces at hand, but also their own minds. They're the architects of their own demise, and sometimes they even want that demise as a result of the obsession. In Uzumaki, Shuichi's father was perfectly happy dying if it meant he could finally become a spiral. In Honored Ancestors, Makita wasn't just happy to join his centipede-like family of heads, he was desperate to. Tomoki in Ice Cream Bus appears to understand that continuing to eat the ice cream will turn him into ice cream and inevitably kill him, but he eats it anyway because he wants to and doesn't seem to care. These stories are perhaps even more disturbing because most of us can relate to at least the concept of being helpless to a compulsion that we don't want to indulge, but the thought of genuinely wanting to do the thing that's going to deform or altogether kill us is much more unsettling and alarming. All of that is why his stories with a focus on the psychological and the extremes of love and obsession are more compelling to many than those with overt physical dangers, because you can escape a physical threat one way or another, even by death, at least in theory, but you can never escape your own mind. Another of the most interesting and compelling themes in most of Ito's stories is humanity. Ito himself acknowledges this, saying, "For me, it is the human who has the potential to make the most fear. Either physically, whether by his actions, or his psyche, there are plenty of parts of the human that can be scary, and my goal is to use the human to try to scare readers as much as possible." This shows through the way that many of the threats facing the characters are human in nature, as I just discussed, like fear, obsession, madness, and frenzied passion. More than that, though, his stories force the reader to contemplate what it really means to be human. What makes us human, fundamentally? How much of that thing can be taken away or corrupted before we are no longer human? How much can we survive and still want to? Deprivation and deformation are often used to make us wonder that. Ito puts characters through extreme transformations to the point that they're barely recognizable as human, like Yuko in Slug Girl, whose head becomes a slug's head. Many of those in Uzumaki suffering from the curse of the spirals. The slug people in Uzumaki who are eventually deemed so subhuman that they're used as food. Kaori in Gyo, who is integrated with the parasite and used as fuel even after death. Reimi in Layers of Fear, who's cursed to be made of layers and eventually become deformed as a result. Tetsudo in Long Dream, whose physical body deforms and deteriorates the longer he spends sleeping, and so many more. Would we, in those positions, still want to be alive? It's something his stories force us to wonder. But it's not just the physical or mental either. Deprivation of basic needs is also something Ito uses to make us wonder what makes us human. Billions Alone, or Army of One, deprives individuals of any human connection. Den of the Sleep Demon deprives Yuji of sleep. Splatter Film or Smashed deprives everyone who's ever tried the nectar of any kind of food or drink. Town Without Streets deprives everyone who lives there of absolutely any privacy at all, and so on. It forces us to wonder what we can live without while still wanting to be alive at all, and subsequently what makes us human. It emphasizes that in many of these stories, the fear isn't that the character will die from their circumstances, but rather that their humanity will be so corrupted and deformed that they no longer want to survive their circumstances, but have to anyway. The focus on humanity as a primary theme isn't always done to create terror alone either, but also despair, loss, and tragedy. Stories like Gentle Goodbye, Scarecrow, and Roar use the desperation to regain lost loved ones to make us question humanity in a painful way rather than a scary way, making us wonder if the forms in which we could bring them back would really be them, really be human. In all of those stories, the main characters are so hopelessly and irreconcilably desperate to see their lost family, friends, or partners that they're willing to accept copies of them that they know aren't the real them and never will be. What's scariest about that isn't overt horror, but rather the overwhelming pain and loss of accepting that it's impossible to truly bring back what's been lost, and what you do manage to bring back will never really be them. We're once again forced with themes of overwhelming inescapability, the knowledge that there is nothing we can do to make those copies real, and that the best we can do isn't enough. Ultimately, because humanity is fundamentally important and integral to all of us, the corruption of it through these stories is even more compelling and frightening, because to lose what defines us or those we love is perhaps one of the most terrifying fates that you could possibly succumb to. The final, most unique and compelling aspect of Ito's stories is the cosmic horror. Cosmic horror is a term coined by H.P. Lovecraft, who called it weird fiction. It explores the insignificance of human existence compared to the vast universe, and the existence of much older, much more powerful beings whose whims we're helpless to. Ito's stories are incomparably scary because not only are the forces at work completely unexplainable, they're unstoppable. As we've discussed, there is no one definable antagonist that can be stopped. The torment the characters are subjected to is at the hands of something far more powerful than humanity that's either influencing us or destroying us. We can't understand or define it, so we can't stop it. It's inexplicable, so it's inescapable. Stories like Gyo and Splendid Shadow Song received criticism for attempting to give scientific explanations to the strange occurrences, because explaining them eliminated or at least reduced that inescapability. It's a criticism that I can understand, and perhaps even agree that the mystique and bizarreness is, to some extent, reduced by explanations. But I personally find that that doesn't make it any less inescapable or scary. Knowing scientifically why something is happening, and still also knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that you're completely powerless to stop it, is a terrifying thought in and of itself. And I think exploring that particular variety of hopelessness is something that Ito did well in those examples, even if it's not what he normally does. Regardless, because so many of the stories are so open-ended and ambiguous, a result of that cosmic horror genre, they also benefit from the strength of being open to interpretation by the reader. The story doesn't often tell you what exactly is to blame for the horrors unfolding, so the reader can effectively project their own fears onto their interpretation. Whatever they think is the most terrifying cause could very well be the real cause. The cause itself, though, isn't the only thing that's unclear and open to interpretation, but also the meaning and significance. In interviews, Ito has had interviewers ask questions where they speculate as to the meaning of certain aspects and themes, at which point he would say he had never even considered those aspects and themes that way at all. In many of these instances, he's confirmed that the interviewer had interpreted a core theme in an entirely different manner than he intended, which speaks to the power his story's ambiguity and lack of clarity has. We can all follow the same plot and see the same events unfold, and we can all have the same basic understanding of that, while still interpreting entirely different meanings, causes, and outcomes. His stories walk the line between being ambiguous and open to multiple interpretations versus being completely inexplicable and impossible to follow, and he almost always walks that line well. Finally, cosmic horror's influence on Ito's work also often results in a lack of proper resolution. We're rarely given closure or a satisfying conclusion that explains the events that took place or the fates of the characters that the stories followed. As a result, we're left wondering, and the story subsequently lingers in our minds, festering as we try to figure out what really happened, making his work in general much more memorable. If we can close a book with a confident understanding of what we just read, we can generally put it out of our minds just as easily. But if we know there's a deeper meaning to its contents that is both unclear and completely up to us to determine and decide on, that book is gonna live on rent-free in our heads until we figure out what that is. Whether Ito himself had a true intended meaning behind a story or not, his choice to leave that meaning up to the reader to interpret and conclude means that those stories get stuck in those readers' heads indefinitely, not just making them more unforgettable to them each individually, but prompting discussion amongst fans indefinitely. Now that we've established what makes Ito's work so unique, distinctive, and popular in terms of both his art style and his storytelling style, we must finally discuss his two major anime adaptations. Over the years, Junji Ito's manga has been adapted into anime format in two primary instances: the Junji Ito Collection in 2018 and Junji Ito Maniac: Japanese Tales of the Macabre in 2023. Both had 12 episodes each containing either one of his short stories, or a chapter of one at least, or a combination of two. During research for this video, I watched both twice, once by myself and once with my wife who hasn't read any of his work, so that I could get the perspective of someone who's not comparing it to anything to see how it holds up on its own. During this section, I'll be sharing both of our thoughts on how well the medium succeeded at interpreting his work, because both series faced a notably poor reception from die-hard fans, and a lukewarm reception from new viewers, and I was very curious to see if we would have the same experience. And as I mentioned at the the beginning, I am not just jumping on the bandwagon of the anime was bad, it sucks, don't watch it. Yes, I think it had some significant shortcomings, and I think it certainly warranted a lot of the criticisms that it received. But I also really enjoyed it in many other ways, and I think it's more than worth mentioning that the medium itself is to blame for a lot of its failures, rather than the creators and animators responsible for these particular adaptations. I also think that the ridiculously high expectations for these adaptations resulting from Ito's overwhelming fame led to a great deal of its poor reception, as hardcore fans had such a clear idea of what they wanted to see and how they wanted to see it that nothing that was actually achievable by animation would have pleased them. So while I will be criticizing it in this section, I will be doing so specifically with the motivation of using it as an example of what is so unique about Junji Ito's art, style, and distinctive charm, because what makes it so unique is also largely what's missing from the anime. That does not by any means mean that I'm suggesting the anime is anywhere near as bad as critics claim, or even bad at all. But as always, I'll break down those reasons into a few primary categories: the adaptation format itself, the addition of color, the animation style, and the story. Naturally, let's start with the adaptation format. Ito's work in general is notorious and memorable because of his style, and as we've established, his style is very much dependent on it being hand-drawn in black and white with exceptional detail, none of which is well suited to animation. Ito himself acknowledges this, saying, "I think pen-drawn art has its own charm. The brightness of the picture produced by the contrast between black lines and the white of the paper, and the atmosphere created by the drawn lines, I think they cannot be expressed by live action so easily." By way of that disadvantage alone, an anime adaptation was always up against relatively impossible to meet standards, something many critics failed to acknowledge. But one way I do think the anime did actually fail rather than just suffer the consequences of its medium was that it effectively just recreated the manga panel by panel, rather than adapting it in a new creative way. Instead of utilizing the new potential assets provided by animation to take a risk and reinterpret the manga more creatively, they tried to simply replicate the source material in another format. Sound, music, visual effects, and creative techniques could have been much better implemented as the assets that they really could have been if added to Ito's stories. But because it was just replicated and not reinterpreted, that wasn't often the case. Two episodes that, to me, show what could have been possible are Ice Cream Bus and Used Record. The former used a much brighter, more vibrant color palette than the others to communicate the deceptively cheery setting, as well as the catchy and eventually disturbing and ominous jingle of the bus, and the latter significantly improved upon the original story with the inclusion of the song. The song that played on the record was a huge narrative focus, so to actually hear it in full haunting, ethereal detail made the whole episode much more powerful, which Ito fully intended on, as he was heavily involved in overseeing the creation of that song called Paula's Scat. These episodes exemplify, in my opinion, how much atmosphere could have been created if sound were better utilized and emphasized through that adaptation, and if they had taken more risks in their interpretations, like the use of very bright colors and other visual techniques. Another aspect of the manga that's simply not well suited to an animated adaptation is the relatively heavy use of unspoken thought or internal monologue. Knowing what the character is thinking, how they're feeling, and what they aren't saying out loud is shown easily in the manga, and is incredibly integral in explaining the plot. In anime, internal monologue in excess can be dull and uninteresting, so it's generally limited unless it's Death Note, and that lack of additional context limits the significance and detail of some stories. Since Ito's work is so focused on the psychological torture that the characters endure, hearing their thoughts and feelings about what they're experiencing is a major part of what makes it disturbing, so the loss of that is felt. This is especially true for new viewers who haven't read the manga. As I mentioned before, Ito often walks the line between open-ended ambiguity and inexplicable plot that's impossible to follow, and without this context, it often falls into the latter category. It's one thing to not know why or how something is happening, but it's another entirely to not know what's happening at all, and this lack of internal monologue contributes greatly to the anime plot not being understandable to the average viewer. There's also a lot of character development and plot detail that's established through internal monologue that, while it isn't necessary to understand the plot, does add to it and make it more powerful, and without it, that impact is lost. This is especially clear in episodes and stories like Library Vision, in which the internal monologue was integral in establishing the significance and severity of Goro's obsession with his library, what happened in his childhood that actually prompted it, the fact that his father also ended up having a breakdown over books going missing, the importance of his diaries, and so much more. All of that was lost in the anime without the internal monologue from the perspective of his wife, and while the episode was still understandable plot-wise, it was much less powerful and hard-hitting than it was in the manga. Finally, the manga makes frequent use of dramatic build-up before ridiculously detailed and horrifying reveal panels, forcing the viewer to take in the image and process it, dwelling on it for a significant period of time in order to make sense of it and fully comprehend the horror of what they're witnessing. Anime, as a medium, is too fast-paced to allow for that rumination, so those reveals are moved past without giving the viewer time to be truly disturbed by them. That results in reveals like the neighbor's face in the neighbor's window, or the sister having layers upon layers of teeth in her mouth in Layers of Fear being breezed past, and subsequently ultimately feeling less significant, because the format just doesn't allow us as viewers to process them in the way they were intended to be processed. Now that we've established the way that the anime adaptation's medium itself did not allow for the best possible reinterpretation of Ito's work and style, let's move on to how its addition and ineffective use of color also contributed to a less than stellar result. As I mentioned in the art style analysis, the addition of color often cripples Ito's work. The line-based shading style is not necessary when color is added, but the line-based shading style is integral in maintaining the dramatic nature of his style. This is the case for the anime, the most recent adaptation more so than the previous, which did still maintain a more significant degree of line-based shading for the most part. This shading and heavy line work, however, was not applied to the backgrounds, making characters and foreground focuses look out of place and unnatural. The contrast of black and white in the manga is another thing that's truly integral in maintaining the style, so adding color immediately reduces that dramatic impact. Mold was the only episode done in black and white, and was largely received as one of the strongest ones as a result because it maintained that style. But I feel like the heavy use of grays rather than the dramatic contrast between black and white lost a great deal of the impact. Those who haven't read the manga first also did not see much value in this color scheme or lack thereof, aside from it being potentially a thematic choice to disguise the color of the mold until it was revealed to be alive, as it being flesh-colored would have been a dead giveaway. Other scenes, like the reveal of Mari and the story of the mysterious tunnel, suffered from the lack of black and white contrast more than others, because it allowed for the dramatic buildup of the obscure, ominous figure in the darkness in the manga, but appeared muddy and unclear in the anime because the figure was not white on a black background. My wife, who didn't know what to look for, was actually unable to see it at all. Ice Cream Bus is the only instance in which I personally find the introduction of color to actually be an improvement upon the original black and white, partially because the vibrancy and brightness of the colors used created more of the contrast than the other duller color palettes lacked, and partially because the bright colors were integral in conveying the upbeat cheeriness of the story, which was so important to setting the scene. Next, when comparing the anime adaptation to its original manga counterpart, we have to discuss how the animation itself fell short. The generic animation style just generally does not reflect Ito's style. That's not necessarily the anime's fault, since it's incredibly difficult to reflect a style like Ito's through animation for all of the reasons we've already discussed. As has been established, his style is largely defined by black and white contrast, hand-drawn textures, and line-based shading, as well as hyper-detailed features. None of that is feasible to incorporate into animation, at least not within a reasonable time frame. It would take forever, which is why the Uzumaki anime, created with all of those stylistic features, is still in production and being delayed. Based on its trailer, it's exactly what we all wanted for the original anime adaptations, and is a true recreation of Ito's style. But the time, effort, and money that's going into making that happen is immense, and 2 whole 12-episode anime adaptations would likely never have been possible within that time frame and budget if they did the same. Even so, I think that if heavy detail and stylized line-based shading was even included only in moments where particularly horrifying creatures and developments were being revealed, that could have allowed for kind of a happy medium. The animation style could have been kept simpler for the majority of the plot, with stylistic aspects more characteristic of Ito's work being used only sparingly, to create more drama and fear in moments that call for it. If you compare these moments in Tomie, Hanging Balloons, Whispering Woman, The Story of the Mysterious Tunnel, and Washed Ashore between the anime and the manga, it's clear to see that those reveals suffered greatly from the lack of detail included. By contrast, this reveal in The Neighbor's Window and this reveal in Long Dream, both of which are strikingly similar to their manga counterparts, are 2 excellent examples of what could have been done in those scenes by use of heavy detail strategically, because I think these instances were incredibly effective, and other scenes would have been as well if they had followed in their footsteps. Another problem with the animation was the presence of too many glaring instances of cheap animation shortcuts, something that was especially noticeable in episodes like Fashion Model, where Fuchi's legs are hidden while she's running so they didn't have to be drawn, and she looks like she's bouncing more than running, and when she's laughing but her mouth isn't even open. This is naturally something that's going to be inevitable sometimes in animation, and was less present in the 2023 adaptation than the 2018 one by far. It's still worth mentioning though, as it is something that many fans have taken issue with. The use of cheap-looking, brush-based textures was another issue that diminished the impact of dramatic scenes, and could reasonably have been expected to be better than that. There are many instances where the grungy, disturbing, heavily lined detailing of the features is one of the only reasons it is so disturbing, and comparing some of those textures between the anime and the manga makes that clear. The 2018 adaptation, in my opinion, did a much better job including these textures and heavy lining than the 2023 version, something that I think is particularly clear when comparing this cheap-ish stock texture in Maniac's mold to the way that Tetsudo's skin is drawn in Collection's Long Dream. Finally, the use of CGI and 3D in both adaptations was also widely regarded as a bad move, with many feeling like it broke immersion and felt too unnatural, lazy, or ultimately not as creepy as it otherwise would have been. I'm personally torn, because I feel like some instances were done well, like certain hanging balloon balloon scenes, while others, in my opinion, fell short, like the Toontown monster. My wife, and others who did not read the manga first, are generally less critical of this, likely because they're not comparing it to the original. Now that we've established the ways the anime adaptations fell short visually, let's talk about where they fell short in terms of the story. For the most part, the adaptations were very accurate in terms of the original stories, at least when they were given full episodes. The tendency to combine two short stories into one episode, however, often resulted in integral plot points being cut out, which left otherwise very interesting and compelling concepts and stories feeling rushed and confusing. Slug Girl, for example, began with a focus on Yuko hating and fearing slugs, which wasn't at all included in the anime, subsequently making it much less scary when she eventually basically became one. Washed Ashore, in the manga, has significant development for the two protagonists, in which it's established that one of them is phobic of the ocean and sea creatures, as well as why, and that both have been having dreams about the ocean that compelled them to come see the creature, even when the former was terrified to. In the story of the mysterious tunnel, they completely cut that Goro was being inexplicably drawn to the tunnel despite his mother having gone missing there, and also cut dialogue that would have been very easy to include that established that people all around town were regularly being drawn in as well. The plot of the manga made it clear that people from all over were ending up there with no memory of going, and often disappearing, but the anime cut that all together, making it seem like Goro, his mother, and his sister were the only ones affected. It also completely cut the fact that his sister didn't just end up in the tunnel a couple of times inexplicably, but rather many, many times, and the frequency of that was pertinent to establishing how scary it really was for them both. It was also never explained that the things in the photos were the souls of those who disappeared in the tunnel, partially because of the lack of internal monologue. It was implied, but it wasn't made clear. The ending in the manga is also much stronger, showing that Goro escaped the tunnel and moved away, but was still drawn back to it even then, just to see their faces there. The adaptation also takes specific chapters out of larger stories, like Tomie, Lovesickness, and the Hikizuri siblings. The Hikizuri siblings episode literally opens with them standing over a burning body with no context at all whatsoever, and it is never addressed again or explained. That scene is actually the end of the manga's previous chapter, which showed how absolutely unhinged this family's pranks were by killing Narumi's boyfriend in the process of one, and that's how they ended up there. But that could not possibly have been even vaguely discerned by the anime's adaptation, because they picked it up mid-plot. Tomie's were done better because they still made sense to someone that didn't know her backstory or the plot that came before the chapters that were adapted, but still would have been stronger if left to their own dedicated series. Lovesickness's adaptation ended after the first chapter, and while it was able to stand on its own in that regard as interesting and compelling, it still would have been much more so if it had been able to show just how much the plot developed afterwards. The themes of psychological horror were much more present and compelling in later chapters, and after showing the episode to my wife, who had never read the manga, as I've mentioned, and then explaining the much wider plot to her, she agreed that it would have been way more fascinating to her if that had been included. Ito has plenty of short stories that could have been adapted in their entirety in the 20-ish minutes allowed by the episode's format, and focusing on those rather than disjointed chapters of larger stories might have been a better move. All of that in mind, I personally feel like it was a combination of all of those reasons, as well as the ridiculously high expectations of fans, that led to the anime's poor reception from the community. And I think illustrating what went wrong with it is incredibly important in illustrating what went right with a lot of Ito's original work. I do have high hopes based on the Uzumaki trailer that it will not fall victim to the same pitfalls as its predecessors, but I also think that the existing two adaptations are worth watching, even if I don't think they're particularly well done in terms of accurately representing the unique charm of Junji Ito's work and style. But finally, 15 pages into this script, we're at the conclusions. After everything we've discussed, where does that leave us? What exactly is it that really made Junji Ito into the horror icon that he is today? Well, obviously, as I've said, style is a huge part of it. Ito's style is undeniably what he's most known for, and subsequently what might set him apart the most from other horror mangaka and artists. It's incredibly unique, defined by its hyper-detailed features, unnatural and dramatized focus on eyes, dramatic black and white contrast, and hand-drawn complex textures. His work is not only horrifying and compelling and impossible to look away from, but it's also recognizable as his at first glance, which is very difficult to achieve. His influences like H.P. Lovecraft, Hideshi Hino, Yasutaka Tsutsui, and Kazuo Umezu clear in his work, but he's still able to separate his own from it and establish it as his own unique style. He's the prime example of someone who deliberately implemented aspects of other artists' styles in his own, while still letting his own individuality shine through, creating an amalgamation entirely his own that's not a copy of anything regardless of its influences. You can look at Hino or Umezu's work and see how it's influenced Ito's, but you would likely never mistake it for his, and that's what's so impressive and important. Furthermore, Ito's stories have always had a huge focus on humanity, as I mentioned, but it's also worth mentioning how present this is in his art itself, too. Unlike a lot of other horror media, Ito's characters, no matter how distorted distorted and deformed they become, are always still recognizably human in some way, be it through physical features or mental awareness and consciousness. What's so powerful about this is that he can distort the human form, mental and physical, while still maintaining it as being the human form. It's horrifying because you know it's still a human being, just subjected to unspeakable torture that's left them in their current state. Anatomical accuracy being the focus in body horror rather than extreme gore or shock value also sets it apart. It's a plausible dramatization of something a human body could realistically undergo in many circumstances, which makes it much more disturbing to observe. And it's never just horror for horror's sake either. It's body horror to support the story and emphasize it. The story is not defined by the body horror is defined by the story. Art aside, I think when comparing Ito's work to horror as a genre, it's the underlying themes he includes that make his manga stand out the most. The themes of the extremes of the human psyche, humanity's corruption, and the powerlessness of humanity against unseen, inexplicable, unstoppable forces are already incredibly compelling and notable. And part of the reason that I believe Ito to be so popular is that he has brought cosmic horror back into the public eye as a genre to a generation that didn't necessarily grow up with it being particularly prominent or common. He doesn't make you fear death, he makes you fear surviving indefinitely despite the indomitable, incomprehensible forces and what they'll force you to endure. It's not just that gives his work so much unique power though. He also tackles a lot of social issues in his work that resonate with his viewers on a personal level. Yes, his manga is a lot of bizarre body horror that visually disturbs the viewer, but it's more than that. It sticks with you and starts living rent-free in your head because it's more than just horror for horror's sake. It's more than scaring you or making you recoil in disgust. Ito wants his stories to make you contemplate the fundamental, existential issues at play in them, and through the use of creative exaggeration, he forces you to. Stories like Billions Alone or Army of One discuss isolation and the value of connecting to other human beings in daily life. Collectivism, the belief that the values of the whole of society should be prioritized over those of the individual, something that's very prominent in Japan as a social issue, is explored in multiple stories, like Shirosuna, Remina, and The Town Without Streets. The desperation of every human being to help those they love is shown in stories like Scarecrow, Gentle Goodbye, Roar, and Blood-Sucking Darkness. The overwhelming power of guilt is shown in Lovesickness, Earthbound, and Death Row's Doorbell. The bronze statue poignantly depicts the fear of aging and losing beauty. Floaters shows the fear of society seeing our true feelings and pain, and how the world abuses any attempt to show it, reinforcing the idea that they should be hidden, pondering not only the value of honesty, but also the reason we want to know the secrets of others, because we care or because we're curious. The significance of cancel culture is shown in stories like Remina and Clubhouse, both of which focus on the opinion of the whole being defining in the outcome for the individual, with the former showing the way a society that loved one person to a ridiculous extent came to hate them even more at the drop of a hat, and the latter showing how easily polarizing opinions will turn two sides against each other regardless of the consequences, something that's also shown in Mirror Valley. No matter what, there is almost always a deeper meaning to a Junji Ito story, although there are occasional exceptions like Memories of a Real Poop, and that deeper meaning is often one that readers find relatable and thought-provoking. Finally, comparing Ito's stories to other prominent examples of popular horror stories, we also have to acknowledge how much the bizarreness of his narratives contributes to his being so comparatively unique. The shift between normalcy and bizarreness is one that draws the viewer into a relatable character and plot by allowing them to project onto the main character, only to become infinitely more disturbed by what that character is subjected to. Mundane topics becoming threatening and disturbing is part of what makes his work so powerful, because the reader imagines themselves in that position much more easily, given that the situation feels initially plausible. The fact that it deteriorates into something completely impossible, bizarre, inexplicable, and impossible to understand is exactly what makes it scary, because it started somewhere so normal, relatable, and understandable. His stories are also much less predictable than others, largely because of just how strange they are. Most people wouldn't naturally consider the concept of a person living inside a chair so that they could be closer to the person sitting in it, and the fact that Ito's work is odd enough to incorporate such a concept is part of what sets it apart. You never know what to expect when you open one of his books, and that's a huge part of the reason it's so consistently interesting. It's hard to get tired of it. You can read his work for hours, and the moment you pick up another book, it's like an entirely different experience, the only similarity being the genre and style. I would know I've read almost everything he's ever written and then reread all of it in the span of a few weeks. Ultimately, in my opinion, it's Ito's art style, imagination, storytelling, and corruption of humanity combined that makes his work so unique. Each aspect on their own would be impressive, but not nearly as memorable, compelling, or powerful. It's all of them working together that results in such an iconic and unforgettable experience for the reader, one that lives on in their minds long after they finish reading. He's truly an inspiration for me and many others, and I would encourage any one of you listening that's interested in horror to check out his manga and his art in general, because while I've already already been talking about this for an unforgivably long time. It's really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what makes his art so truly special. And that's something you should all experience for yourselves. Thank you so much for watching, especially those of you that actually made it to the end despite how ridiculously long this video has been, and I really hope you enjoyed this new type of content. I know it's quite different from my regular commentary videos, but I really enjoyed making it, and if you enjoyed watching it, please let me know. Liking the video, commenting on it, sharing it, subscribing, and just letting me know that you did enjoy it is integral to me making more of it, because I can only devote this amount of time and resources to its creation if it ends up being something you guys actually want to see. So if you want more videos like this in the future, including analysis videos of Junji Ito's individual works, as I mentioned earlier, as well as analysis of other types of content, like games and movies, it's incredibly important that you let me know that by supporting this video. Thank you again for watching, and special thank you as always to channel members Cafe Soleil, Joseph Solomon, Art of Amethyst Fable, and TC Pratt, as well as patrons Batman, Kyle Lowe, Blue Swanson, Cora Fear, Elenk Shi, Soul Crystal, Kim Yen, Shamil Sheep, Crazy Hisar, Gen Tong, Jacobus Peterson, Grayson Xavier, Tyfinch94, Milkbean, Eeyore Heehaw, MG Eclectrica, Blah Mage, TC Pratt, Finn, Grim Spectre, and Steven Jett for their support, and I'll see you in the next one.